The morning sun shone brightly over Gangnam International School. The tall glass building sparkled in the early light as students walked through its front gates. Among them stood Mr. Park Ji-ho, holding his leather briefcase and looking up at what would be his new workplace. At 32 years old, Mr. Park had already taught at some of the best schools in America. With 2 degrees from MIT and 5 years of teaching experience, he was more than qualified for his new job. But today, his heart beat a little faster than usual. "Good morning, Mr. Park." Principal Lee Sun-woo walked up to him with a warm smile. "Ready for your first day?" "Yes, sir," Mr. Park replied, adjusting his blue tie. "I'm looking forward to meeting the students." They walked together through the clean hallways. Students in neat uniforms stopped to bow politely. Many looked at Mr. Park with curious eyes. It wasn't every day they saw a black teacher in their school, especially one who could speak Korean. Principal Lee showed Mr. Park to his classroom. "Class 12A is your first group. There are top mathematics students, but they've been struggling lately." Mr. Park nodded and began setting up his materials. He wrote his name clearly on the whiteboard. Mr. Park Ji-ho, Advanced Mathematics. Below it, he wrote a simple math puzzle that looked easy but had a clever twist. The bell rang, and students filed in quietly. 20 pairs of eyes watched as Mr. Park stood at the front of the room. He could see some uncertain looks, but also many interested faces. "Good morning, class," he said in clear English. "I'm Mr. Park, your new mathematics teacher. But before we start with introductions, can anyone solve the puzzle on the board?" Several hands shot up immediately. Mr. Park picked a student in the front row. "It's 47, the boy said confidently. "Good try." Mr. Park smiled. "But look closer. What if we think about it differently?" For the next 10 minutes, Mr. Park guided the class through different ways to look at the problem. When they finally found the real answer, excited whispers filled the room. "Mathematics isn't just about finding the right answer," Mr. Park explained. "It's about understanding why that answer is right. In this class, we'll learn to think in new ways." As the lesson continued, more students began to participate. Mr. Park noticed one boy in the back, Ta-won, who looked particularly interested. Though Ta-won didn't speak up, his eyes followed every explanation carefully. By the end of class, the students were fully engaged. Even those who usually disliked math were asking questions. Mr. Park had done what he did best, made mathematics interesting and accessible. As the students left, many smiled and thanked him. Principal Lee, who had been watching from the doorway, looked pleased. "Excellent first lesson, Mr. Park," he said. "I think you'll do very well here." What neither of them knew was that outside the classroom, a woman in expensive clothes had been watching through the window. Mrs. Kim Ne-young, a school board member and Taiwan's mother, gripped her designer handbag tightly. Her face showed a mix of surprise and something else, something that would soon cause trouble for everyone. Mr. Park was busy planning his next lesson, unaware that his biggest challenge wouldn't be teaching mathematics. It would be dealing with prejudice in a place where he least expected to find it. But for now, he was happy. His first day was going well, and he had connected with his students. That was all that mattered to him. The morning sun continued to shine through the classroom windows, casting long shadows across the empty desks. The math puzzle still stood on the board, a symbol of the changes that were about to come to Gangnam International School. 2 weeks had passed since Mr. Park's first day. His students were doing better in mathematics than ever before. Even the quieter students were starting to speak up in class. But not everyone was happy about these changes. Mrs. Kim Ne-young sat in her large office at home, looking at her son's latest math test. Tai-won had scored 92%, his highest grade in months. Instead of being pleased, she frowned. "This doesn't make sense," she said, placing the test paper on her expensive desk. "How can your grades improve so quickly with a new teacher?" Tai-won stood nervously in front of her desk. "Mr. Park explains things differently, Mother." He helps us understand the problems, not just solve them. Mrs. Kim's frown deepened. I think I need to see this teaching style for myself. The next morning, Mrs. Kim walked into Gangnam International School without announcing her visit. She wore her finest clothes and carried her most expensive handbag, making sure everyone knew who she was. Principal Lee met her in the hallway. Mrs. Kim, we weren't expecting you today. I'm here to observe Mr. Park's class, she said, not asking for permission. As a school board member, it's my right. Principal Lee wanted to object, but Mrs. Kim was already walking toward the classroom. He followed her, worried about what might happen. Inside the classroom, Mr. Park was teaching calculus. He drew clear diagrams on the board and used simple examples that made difficult concepts easy to understand. Students were taking notes and asking questions, fully engaged in the lesson. Mrs. Kim watched from the back of the room. She noticed how her son Ta-won answered questions correctly and helped other students. This seemed to upset her even more. After class, she approached Mr. Park. Mr. Park, I need to see your teaching credentials. Mr. Park remained calm and professional. Of course, Mrs. Kim. Principal Lee has all my documents. I have degrees from MIT and MIT, she interrupted. And how did you get into MIT? The question hung in the air. Several students who were still packing their bags stopped to listen. Principal Lee stepped forward quickly. Mrs. Kim, Mr. Park is highly qualified. His credentials are excellent, and his students are showing great improvement. Too much improvement, Mrs. Kim said. No one's grades change this fast without something being wrong. Mr. Park kept his voice steady. Mrs. Kim, I'm happy to discuss your concerns about Ta-won's progress. Would you like to schedule a proper parent-teacher meeting? I don't need a meeting, she said. I need to understand why the school hired. She stopped herself, but everyone knew what she had almost said. Principal Lee spoke firmly. Mrs. Kim, please come to my office. Now. As they left, the remaining students gathered around Mr. Park. We're sorry about that, one student said. Not everyone thinks like Mrs. Kim. Mr. Park smiled at them. Thank you. But let's focus on mathematics. We still have derivatives to learn. Later that day, Mr. Park sat in his empty classroom. He looked at the students' test papers, each one showing improvement. He knew he was doing his job well, but he also knew that Mrs. Kim's visit was just the beginning of his problems. Outside his window, the afternoon sun cast shadows across the school courtyard. In Principal Lee's office, raised voices could be heard. And somewhere in the school, Mrs. Kim was already making phone calls, planning her next move. The real test for Gangnam International School was about to begin. And it had nothing to do with mathematics. 1 month into the school year, Mr. Park's mathematics class had become the most talked-about subject at Gangnam International School. Students' test scores were rising steadily. Even better, they were starting to enjoy mathematics. Ta-won sat in his room, looking at his latest homework assignment. He had scored 96%, his highest grade ever. For the first time, he truly understood what he was doing. He wasn't just memorizing formulas anymore. His mother, Mrs. Kim, stood in his doorway. "Show me that homework," she demanded. Ta-won handed her the paper. Mrs. Kim studied it carefully, her face growing darker with each correct answer she saw. "This is impossible," she said. "No one improves this much so quickly. That teacher must be giving you the answers." "No, Mother," Ta-won protested. "Mr. Park never gives us answers. He teaches us how to think about the problems. He's a really good teacher." Mrs. Kim walked out of the room without another word. She went straight to her phone and called other parents from the school board. The next day, Mr. Park was teaching when Principal Lee knocked on his classroom door. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Principal Lee said, "but the school board wants to see your lesson plans and grading system. They're questioning the sudden improvement in student performance." Mr. Park nodded calmly. "Of course, I keep detailed records of everything. After class, Mr. Park was walking to the teacher's room when he heard Mrs. Kim's voice around the corner. "Standards must be dropping," she was saying to another parent. "In my day, teachers didn't just give away good grades. Especially not." She stopped talking when she saw Mr. Park. The other parent looked embarrassed and hurried away. Mrs. Kim stepped forward. "Mr. Park, I want to see your university transcripts, your complete academic history. Right now." "Mrs. Kim," Mr. Park said politely, "all my credentials are on file with the school administration. If you have concerns, please discuss them with Principal Lee. I have every right to question what's happening in my son's class," she said, her voice getting louder. "How do we know your degrees are even real?" Other teachers came out of their rooms to see what was happening. Students stopped in the hallway, watching nervously. Principal Lee arrived quickly. "Mrs. Kim, this is completely inappropriate. Please come to my office immediately." "No," she said, "I want answers right here. How did someone like him get hired at our school?" The hallway went silent. Everyone heard what she meant by someone like him. Mr. Park stood straight and tall. "Mrs. Kim, your son is an excellent student who works hard. His grades reflect his effort and understanding. Nothing more, nothing less." He turned to walk away, but Mrs. Kim grabbed his arm. "Don't you walk away from me. I'll take this to the education board. I'll call the media." Principal Lee stepped between them. "Mrs. Kim, let go of Mr. Park right now, or I will have to call security." Mrs. Kim released her grip, but her face showed pure anger. "This isn't over," she said, before storming away. That evening, Mr. Park sat at his desk, grading papers. He could quit, find another school, somewhere easier. But he looked at his students' work, saw their progress, their growing confidence. He thought about Tawan's smile when he solved a difficult problem. No, he wouldn't quit. His students deserved better than that. What he didn't know was that Mrs. Kim was at home, making a plan that would shock everyone at Gangnam International School. Tomorrow would be a day no one would forget. The next morning started like any other at Gangnam International School. Mr. Park's class was preparing for their college entrance practice exam. This test was very important for their future, and everyone was focused. Mr. Park wrote complex problems on the board, explaining each step carefully. The students took detailed notes. Even the usually chatty ones were quiet, knowing how much this test mattered. Taekwon sat in the front row today. He wanted to understand everything perfectly. His notebook was full of careful notes, and his hand was raised often to ask good questions. Suddenly, the classroom door burst open. Mrs. Kim walked in, holding her phone up and recording everything. Behind her were two other parents from the school board. "Stop this class immediately," Mrs. Kim demanded. "I'm calling the police." The students froze. Mr. Park remained calm, though his heart was beating faster. "Mrs. Kim," he said quietly, "we're in the middle of exam preparation. Please don't disrupt the students' learning." "Learning?" She laughed. "Is that what you call this? I've already called the police. They're on their way to investigate what's really happening in this classroom." Hae-yun, the class president, stood up. "Mrs. Kim, you're interrupting our test preparation. We need to study." Other students began pulling out their phones, recording Mrs. Kim's behavior. They had learned from watching the news that recording incidents like this was important. Mrs. Kim walked closer to Mr. Park's desk. "I've seen my son's grades. No student improves this much without cheating. You must be giving them the answers." Taekwon stood up, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "Mother, stop it. Mr. Park is a good teacher. He never gives us answers. He teaches us how to think." "Sit down, Taekwon," Mrs. Kim shouted. "You don't understand what's happening here." Principal Lee rushed into the classroom, followed by the school security guard. "Mrs. Kim, you need to leave right now. You're disrupting an important exam preparation session." "I'm not going anywhere until the police arrive," she said, still filming. "This man can't be trusted with our children." Mr. Park looked at his students' worried faces. He made a decision. "Class, please take out your textbooks and turn to page 247. We'll continue our review while we wait for this situation to be resolved." The students looked at each other, then opened their books. One by one, they turned their attention back to their studies, ignoring Mrs. Kim. Mr. Park's voice remained steady as he explained complex mathematical concepts. He wrote on the board as if nothing unusual was happening. The students followed along, some still recording with their phones, but all taking notes. Mrs. Kim's face showed confusion. This wasn't the reaction she expected. Instead of chaos, she found order. Instead of fear, she saw determination. 5 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived. Officer Kang and Officer Yoon looked around the peaceful classroom with surprise. They saw a teacher teaching, students learning, and 3 adults with phones recording everything. "We received a call about a disturbance," Officer Kang said, looking directly at Mrs. Kim. The truth was becoming clear to everyone. The real disturbance wasn't coming from Mr. Park or his students. It was coming from those who refused to accept that excellence knows no color. The next few minutes would change everything at Gangnam International School, but not in the way Mrs. Kim had planned. Officer Kang and Officer Yoon stood in the doorway of the mathematics classroom, taking in the scene before them. They saw a well-organized class, students with open textbooks, and a teacher calmly writing equations on the board. "Who called the police?" Officer Kang asked, though he could guess from the way Mrs. Kim still held her phone up, recording everything. "I did," Mrs. Kim said. "This teacher is giving students answers to improve their grades artificially." Officer Yoon looked at the complex mathematics on the board. "Ma'am, this looks like a normal advanced mathematics class to me." Hyun, the class president, stood up again. "Officers, we have video evidence of Mrs. Kim disrupting our class. We're preparing for college entrance exams, and she burst in here without permission." Other students held up their phones, showing their recordings. Principal Lee stepped forward with a tablet in his hand. "Officers, I have security footage showing Mrs. Kim's pattern of harassment over the past month," Principal Lee said. "Mr. Park has been nothing but professional, despite repeated incidents." Officer Kang turned to Mr. Park. "Sir, would you like to press charges for harassment?" Mr. Park shook his head. "No, I just want to continue teaching my students. They have an important exam coming up." Mrs. Kim's face turned red. "But what about my complaint? My son's grades have risen impossibly fast." Taiwan couldn't stay quiet anymore. He walked to the front of the class, holding his notebook. "Officers, please look at my work. Every problem has detailed notes. Mr. Park taught us to understand the concepts, not just memorize formulas. That's why our grades are better." Officer Yoon examined Taiwan's notebook. She saw pages of careful notes, step-by-step solutions, and clear explanations. "Mrs. Kim," Officer Kang said firmly, "disrupting a classroom is a serious offense. You're interfering with these students' education." "But he's," Mrs. Kim started, then stopped herself. "He's what, exactly?" Officer Kang asked, his voice stern. "A highly qualified teacher doing his job exceptionally well." The other parents who had come with Mrs. Kim looked uncomfortable. They quietly left the classroom, wanting no part of what was happening. "Mrs. Kim," Officer Yoon said, "we need to issue you a warning. If you continue to harass this teacher or disrupt this class, there will be serious consequences." Principal Lee stepped forward. "The school board will be meeting this afternoon to discuss this incident. Mrs. Kim, I suggest you leave now." Mrs. Kim looked around the room. She saw her son's disappointed face, the students' phones recording her, and Mr. Park's calm professionalism. Finally, she lowered her phone and walked out. After she left, Officer Kang turned to the class. "I apologize for this disruption. Mr. Park, please continue your lesson." As the officers left, the students broke into applause, not for the police, but for Mr. Park, who had stayed calm and professional throughout the entire incident. "Thank you, everyone," Mr. Park said quietly. Now let's get back to our exam preparation. We have a lot to cover. The students turned back to their books with new determination. They had just learned something more important than mathematics. They had learned about dignity, professionalism, and standing up for what was right. Outside the classroom, Principal Lee was already calling an emergency school board meeting. Things at Gangnam International School were about to change, and this time, it would be for the better. The emergency school board meeting was set for 3 p.m. that day. But by noon, something unexpected was happening outside Gangnam International School. Students began gathering in the courtyard during lunch break. They carried handmade signs with messages like, "Great teachers change lives," and "Education has no color." Hye-hun, the class president, stood on the steps, organizing everyone. "Remember," she told the growing crowd, "this is a peaceful demonstration. We're here to support Mr. Park and show what our school really stands for." Inside the building, Principal Lee prepared for the board meeting. On his computer screen were dozens of emails from parents and teachers, all supporting Mr. Park. He also had security videos showing Mrs. Kim's previous visits to the school, proving her pattern of harassment. The local news had somehow heard about the morning's events. A reporter stood outside the school gates, talking into a camera. This prestigious international school finds itself at the center of an important discussion about discrimination in education. At 2:45 p.m., Taiwan walked into the board meeting room. His mother, Mrs. Kim, sat at the long table with other board members. She looked surprised to see him. "I'm here to speak about Mr. Park," Taiwan announced. His voice shook slightly, but he stood tall. The room filled quickly. Teachers, parents, and student representatives took their seats. Mr. Park sat quietly in the back, watching as his students filled the extra chairs. Principal Lee called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss this morning's incident and its broader implications for our school." One by one, people stood to speak. Teachers talked about Mr. Park's excellent teaching methods. Parents shared how their children had grown to love mathematics. Students described how Mr. Park helped them understand difficult concepts. Then To-won stood up. The room went silent. "Before Mr. Park came, I hated mathematics," he said, looking directly at his mother. "I memorized formulas but never understood them. Now, for the first time, I really understand what I'm learning. My grades improved because Mr. Park is an excellent teacher, not because he gave us answers." Mrs. Kim looked down at her hands. The other board members whispered among themselves. Principal Lee spoke next. "This morning's incident shows we need clear policies against discrimination and harassment. We must ensure all our teachers can work without fear or interference." The board voted immediately. The results were clear. Mrs. Kim would be removed from the school board. The school would create new anti-discrimination policies, and Mr. Park would receive a formal apology. Outside, the student demonstration had grown larger. When word of the board's decision reached them, they cheered so loudly that the sound echoed through the school halls. Mrs. Kim left the meeting room quickly, avoiding everyone's eyes. As she walked to her car, she passed the students in the courtyard. She saw their signs, their determination, and perhaps for the first time, she saw her own prejudice clearly. Inside, Mr. Park thanked everyone for their support. "The real heroes today are the students," he said. "They showed us what it means to stand up for what's right." As the sun set over Gangnam International School, things were different. Something had changed. Tomorrow would bring new policies, new understanding, and new hope. But for now, Mr. Park had papers to grade and lessons to plan. Because no matter what happened, he was, first and always, a teacher. 1 month passed after the incident at Gangnam International School. The hallways looked the same, but many things had changed. Principal Lee stood at the front of the assembly hall, addressing the entire school. Behind him was a large banner that read "Excellence through Understanding." Next to him stood Mr. Park, now wearing a new badge that said Department Head. "Today, we celebrate positive changes in our school," Principal Lee announced. Our new anti-discrimination policies are now in effect. Every teacher and student has completed our inclusion training. The students listened carefully. Many smiled at Mr. Park, who had become one of the most respected teachers in the school. In his new role as department head, Mr. Park had started sharing his teaching methods with other teachers. Mathematics scores were improving across all grades. Other departments began adopting his approach of teaching understanding, not just memorization. After the assembly, Mr. Park walked to his classroom. On the wall outside hung a framed newspaper article. The headline read, "Local School Leads the Way in Educational Excellence and Inclusion." The article told the story of how one incident had changed an entire school for the better. Inside his classroom, Mr. Park found an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Kim stood there, looking very different from the angry person who had disrupted his class a month ago. She seemed smaller somehow, more humble. "Mr. Park," she said quietly, "I came to apologize properly." She placed an envelope on his desk. "This is my formal apology letter. I'm also sending one to the school board and the local newspaper." Mr. Park listened as she continued. "I was wrong," she said. "I let my prejudice blind me to what was best for the students, including my own son. Taiwan's understanding of mathematics has grown so much under your teaching." Before Mr. Park could respond, Taiwan appeared at the door. He had been helping younger students with their mathematics during lunch breaks, something he never would have done before. "Mother," Taiwan said, surprised to see her there, "are you here to apologize to Mr. Park?" Mrs. Kim nodded. "Yes, I'm trying to learn from my mistakes." Mr. Park smiled gently. "Mrs. Kim, thank you for your apology. In mathematics, we learned that mistakes are opportunities to understand better. The same is true in life." That afternoon, Mr. Park attended a meeting with educators from other schools in Seoul. They wanted to learn about Gangnam International School's new policies and teaching methods. The incident that could have divided the school had instead made it a model for others. Principal Lee sat next to Mr. Park during the meeting. "You've changed our school," he whispered. "Not just the mathematics department, but how we think about education itself." Mr. Park thought about his students. He thought about Mrs. Kim's apology. He thought about how one difficult moment had led to so many positive changes. As the meeting ended, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Hae-yun, the class president. Their class had just received their practice college entrance exam results. Every single student had improved their score. Outside the window, cherry blossoms were starting to bloom, marking the beginning of spring. It seemed right that as nature was changing, the school was changing too. And these changes would last far longer than the cherry blossoms. The spring cherry blossoms bloomed again at Gangnam International School. 1 year had passed since the incident that changed everything. The school looked different now, with new signs promoting diversity and inclusion hanging in the hallways. Mr. Park sat in his office, which he had earned after becoming the head of mathematics department. On his wall hung pictures of last year's graduating class. They had all done exceptionally well on their college entrance exams. A knock on his door interrupted his work. It was Ta-won, home from his first year at Seoul National University. He looked more confident now, wearing his university jacket with pride. "Mr. Park," Ta-won said, smiling, "I came to thank you again. University mathematics is much easier because of how you taught us to think." Mr. Park invited him to sit down. "How is your mother doing?" he asked kindly. "She's different now," Ta-won replied. "She volunteers at a multicultural education center. She tells everyone about how her prejudice almost kept her son from learning from the best teacher he ever had." Their conversation was interrupted by Principal Lee, who entered with exciting news. "Our school has been chosen as a model for inclusive education," he announced. "Schools from across Korea want to learn from us." Mr. Park looked at the documents Principal Lee brought. The school's test scores had improved across all subjects, not just mathematics. Teachers had learned that when they focused on understanding rather than memorization, all students could excel. Later that day, Mr. Park taught a demonstration class for visiting teachers. They watched as he showed how to make complex mathematics accessible to everyone. In the back of the classroom sat Mrs. Kim, now a regular speaker at educational conferences where she shared her story of learning and change. The most important thing in education, Mr. Park told the visitors, is believing that every student can succeed. When we remove barriers of prejudice, amazing things happen. After school, Hye-yun, now in her final year, stopped by his office. She had been accepted to Harvard University, where she planned to study education. "You inspired me to become a teacher, Mr. Park," she said. "I want to help change education like you did." That evening, as Mr. Park prepared to leave, he found a new group of students in his classroom. They were older students helping younger ones with mathematics, a program that had started after last year's events. They called it the Understanding Circle. Principal Lee joined him in watching the students. "You know," he said quietly, "what happened last year could have destroyed our school. Instead, it made us better." Mr. Park nodded. He remembered the fear and anger of that day, but more importantly, he remembered how his students stood up for what was right, how one incident had sparked a movement for positive change. As he walked to his car, Mr. Park saw new cherry blossoms falling like snow. The school would continue to change and grow, just like the students had taught. And somewhere in the city, other schools were beginning their own journeys toward understanding. The story of Gangnam International School had become more than just a lesson about mathematics. It had become a lesson about human dignity, growth, and the power of education to change hearts and minds. And that was the greatest lesson of all.